Hello, everyone. I hope that this message, this video, finds you well and your family doing well. And I pray that as each day passes, good things are coming your way. And I do know and understand the challenges of the day, but also know and understand God's blessings on everything that happens to us and for us. And so hope some of those, at least spiritual blessings, may be coming your way. For this evening's video, it'll be a little bit different. I am a bit more off the cuff than usual. So I hope I will be coherent as we go throughout this class. It's been an exceedingly busy time for us at school, at HCU, with so many things going on, and so my schedule has been pretty thin as of late, and so I've got some reflections off the top of my head, not entirely off the top of my head, but I do ask that you forgive me if I'm having to put this together as we go and as we talk. Some of the reflections coming from some reading that I'm doing, and also tying it back to maybe a story in that Jesus tells to help us on our journey. So I don't intend to take a lot of your time this evening, but want to think through a couple of these thoughts. As a leadership team at HCU, we are working through this book by Simon Sinek called Start With Why, Leaders Eat Last. Leaders Eat Last is the lead title of the book. And this is not a religious book at all. This is a business book about appropriate management and leadership in today's world. And we work through the book on a weekly basis, trying to take time about reading some chapters and sharing with one another. And our most recent chapters were about what they call the book calls abstraction. It actually has even broader application than that. Let me explain what I'm talking about here, so hopefully that it'll make sense. There was a famous experiment that was done in 1961 by a psychologist named Milgram. And it's an interesting experiment that came on the heels of the capture of one of Nazi Germany's famous lieutenant colonels, Adolf Eichmann, who managed to escape the initial Nuremberg trials following the war, and using fake documentation, he was able to hide and lived as a guy named Ricardo Klement up until 1960. And some of you are probably familiar with this, remember this from history. And so as he was caught, on the heels of this fellow by the name of Milgram wanted to do some experimentation with how people just follow orders. So one of the biggest strangenesses to Milgram was how so many people in Nazi Germany could have committed the horrendous acts that they committed in concert with the Holocaust, and how so many of them, it was said, we were just following orders. So you have this picture of Nazi Germany where hundreds, thousands, even millions of people following orders that you would have expected some of them to not have believed in the things that they were allowing to happen or doing and participating in themselves. So Milgram wanted to do an experiment, and so his experiment was that he got volunteer participants to sign up to partake in the experiment, and one person in the experiment was a true volunteer, and the other person in the experiment was not a volunteer, but was actually in on the ruse, so to speak. And so what they did was the one who volunteered would pull out of a hat a piece of paper, and it would say whether or not they were the teacher or the student in the experiment. And what they didn't know is that every single piece of paper said teacher. So it didn't matter who pulled what they pulled out, it was always going to be the teacher. And the other person who was in on the ruse was always the student. But the volunteer did not know that they were in on the experiment. And so what they did was the teacher would shock the student in various situations when they were asked to by the administrator. So the administrator would tell the teacher to shock the student. And the panel, which they would pull the levers, went from like 0, which was very little shock, all the way up to there was a label XXX, which said 475 volts. And so it was very clear on the panel that if you do this, this will really hurt someone. Okay. And so they did this in 4 stages. With one group of people, the teacher had to shock the student who was sitting right next to them, and they had to actually physically put the student's hand in the place to where it would be shocked, and then they had to hit the button. The second group, they were in the same room with the student, but they hit the button and did not have to touch the student. The third group was the student was in another room, and then the operator would push the button, and the student in the other room would then get the shock. And in that group, they had the student to express pain loudly, to scream every time the button was pushed. And then the fourth group, every time the person pushed the button, they would only hear thuds in the other room where the other person was. So Milgram is trying to see how far people will go just taking instruction. And what they found was quite shocking. He believed, going into the experiment, that only about 2%, 2 or 3%, would actually go through with pressing the highest shock button when they were told to. And what they found was quite different. In the instances in the first group where the person had to actually be in the room and touch the other person, they 30% still went all the way through with the shocks at the highest level. In the second group, where they were in the same room but didn't have to touch the person, that number went up to 40%. When they put the student in the other room, though, it went drastically up, and 65% of the people were able to go all the way to the end and press that last button on the experiment switch. And then when in the very last group, it was 70% who were able to. I believe I'm getting these numbers right. Now, this experiment would be completely unethical today. You could not do it because it caused a great bit of distress for these volunteers who went through with what the people were telling them to do. But their response was, in the end, when they started taking all of this down, their response was similar to what Milgram was wondering about in the Nazi Germany idea, and that is their response was, we were just following orders. Even though those orders meant in some cases that the person was extremely uncomfortable and that was pushing the buttons, knew they were shocking the person in the room, they still moved forward with it, even though it made them uncomfortable. So they followed the rules and then blamed others because the rules were just what they were doing. So they said, I was told to, so that's why I did it. Why did I go through that very lengthy explanation of this experiment, which is very famous now, and but cannot be repeated, obviously, because of how devastating it was to the participants who did follow orders, but still at the end knew what they did was wrong. Well, I'm simply using it as an illustration for how we sometimes can follow the rules and get the rules right, but we may lose what is right in our following of the rules. And I think we're all capable of that, of doing things just because we think we're supposed to, rather than actually sensing what is right and doing the right thing within the rules. So there's following the rules, and then there's following the rules in the right manner with the right motivation, etc. And there's a sort of sense in which we have to really pay attention to not just checking off boxes, but to also, very importantly, making sure that what we are doing is in the right. And I share that also with you to think about and reflect on this story in Luke's gospel as we continue on our journey of understanding the life of Christ. And you're very familiar with this story, so I'm not sharing anything new with you. It's just this illustration that Jesus uses between the Pharisee and the publican. You'll remember the story that Jesus says through this parable, that there were some people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous, and they viewed others with contempt. And you know the story. The Pharisee prays the prayer, God, I thank you, I'm not like other people. Swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes of all I get. That's verses 11 and 12. So I want to pause just for a moment. I want to ask you the question, is what the Pharisee says that he's not like other people? He's not a swindler. He's not unjust. He's not an adulterer. He's not like the tax collector. He fasts twice a week, and he pays tithes of all that he gets. I want to ask you a question. Is that true? Is the Pharisee being true in his statement that that's the kind of person that he was? My guess is that is an accurate description of the Pharisee. Pharisees were known to be extremely diligent in their pursuit of handling the specific commandments that they accepted, as closely, adhering to them as closely as possible, and making sure that they were diligent in that respect and regard. So if that's true, why do we feel such repulsion? If you're like me, you feel repulsed by the Pharisee in this passage. Well, I think the repulsion comes in verse 11, when you read that, God, I thank you that I am not like so-and-so. What a self-righteous prayer that's not dependent on God, but it is a explanation to God of how great he was, rather than his dependence on God. Now, so what does this have to do with my thinking about sort of the rules and the right? Well, he probably was operating within the rules, but he missed an incredibly important aspect of following God's will and God's word, and that was the issue of the heart. And the tax collector, which the tax collector is selected in this story on purpose, because from our study on Matthew, where we talked about the calling of Matthew / Levi, that they were completely and universally disdained in the first century. But this tax collector stands up, beats his breast, and says, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. Now, Jesus' point in this parable is on humility. The exaltation of self versus the humility versus our humility will have a major impact on how we appear before God. And I'm just making a side point that there's the right way to follow God's commandments, and we won't be able to say in the end, well, I just was doing what I was told, if we're not getting it right in the heart, not just right in the letter of the law. So I think those distinctions are incredibly important. There's some other stories. Again, I'm sharing some of these stories are coming from this book, Leaders Eat Last. One of the examples that they give in the book is the story of the Titanic, and I'll close with this. The Titanic was a new ship, a new kind of ship that was developed in the time where ferries were the kind of the big deal, and most of the codes that were written for the ferries to operate under were specifically designed for ferries. So you can imagine that the Titanic is not a ferry. It's a huge boat. So when the Titanic sinks, they didn't have enough lifeboats on the Titanic. You're well familiar with that. You know about this. Well, why did they not have enough lifeboats on the Titanic? Well, the code, the law, the letter of the law didn't require them to have a lifeboat for every person on the ship. Well, should they have had a lifeboat for every person on the ship? Now history has taught us, yes, they should have. Sometimes it's not just about fulfilling the letter of the law, it's also fulfilling the spirit of the law and knowing what the right thing to do is in each situation. And we always have to wrestle with God's word to come to that understanding of what the right thing to do is. Well, I hope that these thoughts may spur you to think, may help you on your faith journey. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. I look forward to seeing you soon.